You know, I used to think that the biggest heartbreaks in life came from people walking away. But sometimes they come from the ones who stay, laughing at your pain, smiling while they erase the parts of you that mattered most. Hi, I'm Nate, and I was supposed to get married last spring. To someone I loved, to someone I trusted. But instead of walking down the aisle, I walked out of a rehearsal dinner because they mocked the one person who made me who I am, my mom. She wasn't there to defend herself. She passed 2 years ago. But that didn't stop my fiancé and her parents from turning her into a punchline. What followed wasn't a meltdown. It was a stand, one I wish I'd taken sooner. This is not just a breakup story. It's about dignity, about drawing a line when love starts to feel like humiliation with a smile. And maybe if you've ever been laughed at when you were grieving, if you've ever had to swallow your voice just to keep the peace, you'll see a bit of yourself in this too. Because sometimes canceling a wedding isn't the tragedy, it's the beginning of healing. Everyone has a story worth telling. Maybe this reminded you of yours. Share it with us, anonymously, through the link pinned in the comments. We'll turn your strength into a story someone else might need to hear. And here's more. For every 1,000 views, we'll donate $1 to a fund supporting people rebuilding their lives after loss or betrayal. Because your story doesn't just deserve to be heard, it can help others heal too. So stay with me. This one's for anyone who's ever walked away, not because they gave up, but because they finally stood up.
Tràn đầy cảm xúc, hơi nghẹn ngào, nhưng vẫn rõ ràng, tôn trọng nhân vật mẹ, không bi lụy, thể hiện lòng biết ơn. I work in graphic design. I own more indoor plants than furniture, and up until a few months ago, I thought I was getting married. Not just to a woman I loved, but to the whole story that came with her. The late-night pancakes, the playlists on road trips, the inside jokes that only make sense after year 3. I thought I knew who I was saying yes to. I was wrong. Her name was Jessica. Smart, stunning, quick to laugh, and somehow allergic to boundaries in the most charming way. She had this magnetic pull, the kind of presence that made strangers overshare and old people wink. I met her at a backyard wedding in Bend, Oregon, where she made fun of my tie and then drank the last of my wine. That was 6 years ago. She made life feel like a story worth telling. But when you fall in love, no one really warns you about the annex package, the family. Jessica's parents, Rick and Linda, were the kind of people who introduced themselves with their job titles first and their names second. Rick sold real estate like he was closing deals with God. Linda ran a lifestyle blog, which was just a digital scrapbook of how everyone else was doing life wrong. They had money, or at least they had taste that suggested money. Monogrammed napkins, custom martini olives, heated toilet seats. At first, I thought it was funny, quirky even. They hosted dinner parties where the wine had backstories, and the appetizers had names I couldn't pronounce. But slowly, the quirk turned cold. The jokes weren't just jokes, they were status checks. Constant reminders that I was lucky to be in the room. That their daughter was somehow marrying beneath her. Rick once told me over scotch, "It's nice Jessica found someone grounded. A working-class background builds character." He said it like he was complimenting a rescue dog. Linda was subtler. She'd smile while suggesting I update my wardrobe to something more coastal. I'm from Corvallis. I grew up mowing my neighbor's lawn for $10. I didn't own coastal. These weren't isolated moments. They were patterns. a steady drip of condescension dressed up as concern. And Jessica? She laughed along, shrugged it off, said they meant well. So I convinced myself it didn't matter, that love was about patience, that marrying someone doesn't mean you marry their family, that I could keep my head down and my dignity intact. But there's a fine line between being gracious and being invisible. I didn't see it yet, but I was slowly disappearing in the name of keeping the peace. And no one noticed, not even me. That's the thing about people like Rick and Linda. Their cruelty isn't loud. It's quiet, polished, practiced, and it always comes with a smile. The kind of smile that makes you question if it was really that bad. It was. Looking back now, the signs were there. I just didn't want to believe them. But everything changed the day they decided my mother's memory was fair game. And that's where we're headed next. Because before everything fell apart, there was one person who held it all together. Her name was Mary Ann. She was my mom. And she deserved better.
She wasn't flashy. She didn't post inspirational quotes or lecture anyone on how to live right. She just did the work, quietly, consistently, without ever expecting applause. She spent 30 years as a nurse, the kind of nurse who stayed late without complaining and always carried extra granola bars in her pockets for patients, not herself. If you needed help and didn't know who to call, somehow she'd show up anyway. When Jessica's family was in trouble, when their restaurant was weeks from shutting down and no bank would take their call, my mom stepped in. Not with judgment, not with lectures, just a calm voice and a willingness to help. She co-signed their business loan when no one else would. They barely knew her, and she was already putting her name and credit on the line for them. And she didn't stop there. When their industrial oven broke and replacing it would have meant shutting down for weeks, my mom paid for a new one out of her own savings. She didn't tell anyone. She just handed Rick the receipt and said, "Make sure it gets installed before Friday's dinner rush." She helped with their bookkeeping. She reorganized their staffing plan. She proofread the grant proposal Rick submitted to the city. She even babysat Linda's grandkids so they could catch up on paperwork without distractions. No strings attached, no reminders, no power plays. She gave because that's what she did. And they took. They took her time, her money, her care, her presence, and they gave back nothing but a few stiff nods at family dinners and the occasional, "We appreciate you," with the warmth of a voicemail prompt. But that was who she was. She believed kindness was strongest when it was invisible. She believed real support wasn't something you held over people. It was something you gave to lighten their load. That's the difference no one talks about. Some people help so they can be thanked. Others help because they remember what it felt like to carry things alone. My mom was the second kind. And that's why what happened later, at the rehearsal dinner, cut so deep. It wasn't just a cruel joke or a bad moment. It was a public mockery of the one person who had done more for that family than anyone in the room. And in that moment, something in me snapped. Because when people talk about your dead mother like she was a burden in front of a crowd and no one steps in to stop it, you stop caring about keeping the peace. You start remembering who you are and who she was, and you decide to act. It didn't start with anything big. No one threw a plate. No one screamed across a parking lot or stormed out of brunch. It started with small things. A joke that didn't land. A look that lingered a beat too long. A comment that felt more like a correction. The first time Jessica rolled her eyes when I mentioned including my mom in our wedding vows, I thought she was just nervous. We were deep into planning, and tension was high. Everyone's nerves were showing. She said, "Nate, do you really want to bring up someone who passed away during the ceremony? Isn't that kind of heavy?" And I remember feeling this weird guilt, like I had somehow made her uncomfortable by wanting to honor my mom. I told myself I was being sensitive, that people grieve differently, that not everyone gets it. But that moment stuck. Then there were the little ways her parents, Rick and Linda, would talk about my background. Never directly insulting, just gently condescending. Like when Rick said, "You're good with tools, right? Guys like you usually are," after I offered to help fix their garage door. Or when Linda smiled and said, "We should find you a good tailor before the wedding. We don't want you looking like the best man and the caterer." Sometimes I'd laugh along. Other times I'd pretend not to hear. But every time, it chipped away at something I didn't have words for yet. The pattern was subtle, but it was constant. I was being made to feel like an outsider in my own life. And Jessica? She rarely noticed. And when she did, she brushed it off. "They're just teasing," she'd say. Or, "They like you, that's just how they are." But affection doesn't sound like criticism. And jokes don't sting unless there's a little truth behind them. I started to realize that love isn't just about how two people treat each other. It's also about what they allow others to get away with. Jessica wasn't unkind, but she was passive. And when you stay quiet around people who disrespect your partner, you're not neutral. You're complicit. That's the part no one teaches you. Sometimes the biggest red flags don't show up in dramatic fights. They show up in quiet moments, in patterns, in how often you have to explain away your own discomfort. They show up when you realize you're shrinking, not growing, inside a relationship that once made you whole. And I kept ignoring them. Because when you want something to work badly enough, you start confusing pain with effort. But the signs were there. And I wish I had listened earlier, before everything escalated, before the night that changed everything. Because when you walk into a room expecting a celebration and walk out questioning everything, you don't forget that feeling. Especially when it starts with a dinner.
The rehearsal dinner was supposed to be a celebration, a quiet evening with family and close friends, good food, soft music, and maybe a few awkward toasts that you'd look back on with affection. That's what I had pictured. What we got instead was a performance. Jessica's parents offered to host the dinner at a high-end restaurant they had some vague connection to. Rick said something about helping them get their liquor license years ago, like it was a personal favor to the state. Linda couldn't stop talking about the floral arrangements. "Everything will be Instagram-worthy," she said. And I think that was the first sign it wasn't about us. When we arrived, it already felt off. There were place cards on the tables with calligraphy so ornate it took 2 minutes to find my name. The lighting was dim, but not cozy, more like private auction. My side of the guest list, which included my dad, my sister, and a few close friends, was seated off to one corner near the emergency exit. The rest of the room was filled with Jessica's extended family and people I'd never seen before, business partners, country club friends, someone who used to sell Linda skincare. I asked Jessica about it. She barely looked up from her phone and said, "My family's just bigger. Don't make it weird." The dinner began, and from the start, it was clear we were guests at someone else's event. Rick played host, shaking hands like a politician. Linda gave the waitstaff instructions as if she ran the place. It felt more like their anniversary party than the night before our wedding. Then came the speeches. Rick stood up first. He tapped his glass, gave a smirk, and launched into what can only be described as a corporate keynote about his daughter's accomplishments. He talked about Jessica's drive, her standards, and how proud they were that she was marrying someone who keeps her grounded. He said it like I was a golden retriever, loyal, harmless, convenient. There was laughter from his table, nervous but real. Linda followed. She started sweet, how Jessica had always been their sunshine girl, but within minutes it turned. She made a joke about how Jessica had to be so patient teaching Nate how to fold linen napkins, and how he's getting there slowly. Everyone laughed again. I didn't. I looked at Jessica. She was smiling. And then Rick returned to the mic. He said he wanted to take a moment to honor someone who's no longer with us. My mom. For 1 second I thought, maybe he was going to do something decent. But then he said, Marianne was passionate. She had opinions about everything, always had to help, even when you didn't ask. Linda joined in. Oh, remember how she used to just show up with solutions before anyone could finish explaining the problem? That was Marianne. They laughed. And Jessica? She laughed too, quietly, but she did. I sat there frozen. I didn't even know what emotion came first: shock, anger, shame. Because they weren't just mocking my mother, they were turning her kindness into a punchline. The same woman who saved their business, who held their children, who paid for their oven, was now the subject of a dinner joke. In front of friends, in front of my family, in front of me. And not one of them flinched. That was the moment something shifted. It wasn't about the dinner anymore. It wasn't even about the wedding. It was about how much disrespect a person can swallow before something breaks. Because love doesn't mean letting people laugh at your pain. And grief doesn't become lighter when others make it small. I didn't know it yet, but that dinner wasn't the prelude to a wedding. It was the beginning of an ending.
Thing about passive-aggressive people is they don't insult you directly. That would be too obvious, too risky. They insult you sideways, with a smile, in a room full of people, while holding a champagne glass. Rick and Linda didn't say my mom was a burden. They didn't use words like intrusive or overbearing. No, they called her passionate, involved, and always ready to jump in, even when no one asked. They used polite vocabulary to mask something ugly. And the worst part? It worked. The room chuckled along. Because when people wear pearls and use big words, it's easy to forget they're saying something cruel. It's easy to excuse bad behavior when it's dressed up like a toast. Rick's voice was smooth. We'll certainly keep Marianne's enthusiastic spirit alive. Let's just hope Nate doesn't inherit her need to take over everything. He raised his glass. People raised theirs too. And for a second, I questioned myself. Maybe I was overreacting. Maybe it wasn't meant that way. Maybe I was being too sensitive. That's how it happens. That's how disrespect hides. In polished language. In the space between the words. In the silence that follows. But I wasn't imagining it. Because I saw my dad's face. His jaw was locked. I saw my sister shift in her seat, folding her arms tight. I saw my best friend shake his head, slowly, like he couldn't believe what he was hearing. And I looked at Jessica. She wasn't surprised. She wasn't upset. She was smiling, laughing along, like mocking the dead was just part of the evening's entertainment. That was the moment the room got louder. but everything inside me went quiet. There's a special kind of pain that comes from watching someone laugh at what you love. A kind of betrayal that's not about words, but about the lack of resistance. Because it's one thing when your fiancé's parents disrespect your mother. It's another thing entirely when the woman you're about to marry lets them do it. And it made me realize something I should have seen much earlier. Jessica wasn't afraid of confrontation. She just chose where to spend her courage, and it was never on me. In that moment, I stopped trying to be polite. I stopped caring if I made people uncomfortable, because there's a line between keeping the peace and losing your self-respect, and they had just crossed it. That dinner wasn't a mistake. It was a message. One that had been delivered over and over in quieter ways for years. But this time, it was on a microphone, in front of a room, with my mother's name hanging in the air like a bad joke. And I decided I wasn't going to let it end there. Because if no one else in that room was going to speak for her, then I would.
When you spend years swallowing things, little jabs, quiet slights, half smiles that carry full insults, there comes a moment when something catches in your throat and won't go down. For me, that moment came right after Linda said, "Let's hope Nate doesn't inherit Marianne's enthusiasm for meddling," and a few people laughed like they were in on some harmless joke. Like this wasn't about my mother. Like this wasn't happening in front of my father, my sister, me. I didn't plan to say anything. I didn't have a speech ready. I didn't even stand all at once. It was more like something inside me stood first and the rest of me just followed. My chair scraped against the hardwood, loud, awkward, final. The room went quiet, but it wasn't a respectful silence. It was the kind where people freeze, not out of empathy, but anticipation. I looked at Rick, at Linda, at Jessica. I saw no regret, just that same expression you see when someone's told a story they think is clever and the room didn't laugh loud enough. I kept my voice low at first. "Are you serious right now?" Linda blinked. "Michael." She always called me by my full name when she was pretending to be gracious. "It was just a bit of humor." "It was a bit of something," I said, louder now. "But it wasn't humor." I turned to the room. For those of you who don't know, Marianne, my mom, helped keep their restaurant open. She co-signed their loan, bought them an oven, paid for childcare so they could keep working. Never once asked for anything back. People looked at their wine glasses, at the floor, anywhere but me. And tonight, I said, you decided to remember her as a punchline. Rick leaned back in his chair. "Let's not turn this into a scene." "Too late," I said. "You already did." I felt my hands shaking. I looked at Jessica. "You could have stopped it. You could have said something, but you laughed." She whispered, "Can we please talk outside?" I shook my head. "No, we're talking here, in front of the same people who just watched you stay silent while your parents mocked the only woman who ever treated your family with unconditional kindness." The room held its breath. That's when I realized something. I wasn't just angry. I was done. Because here's what no one tells you. You don't lose yourself all at once. You lose yourself one compromise at a time, one silence at a time, and eventually you realize the room you're in doesn't feel like your life anymore. So I said the one thing I hadn't let myself say out loud, not to Jessica, not to myself. This wedding is off. There were gasps,
forks hitting plates. A few phones came out, of course. It's 2025. Jessica looked like she'd been slapped. "What are you talking about?" "I'm talking about dignity," I said, "and how I just found mine again." I walked out without another word. My dad followed, my sister too. And for the first time in a long time, I felt something close to peace. But walking away is only part of the story. What came next was the storm, and it knocked harder than I expected. The morning after I called off the wedding, I woke up to 97 unread messages. I didn't need coffee to feel awake. My phone was already vibrating with a mix of panic, shame, and pity. None of it mine. Jessica had texted first, then called, then texted again. Her words blurred together. "I'm sorry. I didn't know they would say that. Can we just talk?" Rick's message was different. "You embarrassed us in front of everyone. That's on you." Linda sent a voice memo. I didn't play it. And then there were the texts from people I hadn't heard from in years. Second cousins, family friends, Jessica's co-workers. Some saying I was brave, others suggesting therapy. A few told me I had overreacted, but in a tone that made it clear they weren't surprised. I didn't respond to anyone. That silence, that space, I needed it. Because for the first time in a long time, my world wasn't spinning around Jessica's comfort, or Rick and Linda's expectations, or some idea of what a perfect son-in-law should look like. I was just breathing again. That afternoon, Jessica showed up at my apartment, still in the dress from the night before, makeup smudged, eyes red. I opened the door, but I didn't invite her in. She said, "Please, I need to explain." So I listened. She told me she didn't know what to do when her parents started making those jokes, that she felt caught in the middle, that she was trying to keep things from getting worse. But doing nothing doesn't keep things from getting worse. It just makes you part of the damage. She said, I froze. And I get it. I do. But there's a difference between freezing and disappearing. She said she was sorry, that she loved me, that we could still make it work. I asked her one question. Why didn't you say anything? Not one word. Not even after. Why? She didn't answer. Because she didn't have one. Some part of her expected me to take it, to let it go, like I'd always done before. That's what shocked her most. Not what her parents said, but the fact that this time I didn't stay. And that's when I realized something. You can love someone and still not be safe with them. You can share years, stories, keys, beds, and still not have a person who'll stand up for you when it counts. Jessica wasn't cruel, but she was silent when I needed her most. And silence, when something sacred is being torn apart, is not love. It's permission. That's what people don't tell you. Sometimes the heartbreak isn't in the betrayal itself. It's in the moment you realize someone watched it happen and chose not to stop it. That day, I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I just asked her to leave. And when the door closed, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt empty, but clear. Because walking away isn't the end of the pain. It's the beginning of something else. Something harder. Something freer. But it wasn't over yet. Because sometimes when you think you've taken your last hit, life throws one more at you.
A week after the rehearsal dinner, I was going qua my mom's keepsake box. It's something I hadn't touched since the breakup. Honestly, I hadn't felt ready. But that day, something pulled me there. Like I needed to remind myself why I'd walk away in the first place. The box wasn't big, just a simple wooden one with a velvet lining and her name carved on the inside lid. Inside were pieces of her life,
The church program from her retirement, the old Polaroid of her and my dad dancing in the kitchen, and a locket, small, gold, delicate. That locket had been in our family for 3 generations, passed from mother to daughter, until my mom broke tradition and gave it to me before she passed. She said, "You'll know who to give it to when the time is right." I'd kept it safe for years, never touched it, never moved it. I didn't wear it, I just honored it. But that day, when I opened the box, it was gone. I thought maybe I'd misplaced it, maybe it fell behind the lining. I searched every drawer, every corner. I even checked under the rug. Nothing. My stomach turned. There had only been one person in my apartment since the breakup, Jessica. She came over to return the engagement ring, asked to use the bathroom. I'd thought nothing of it at the time. Now it was all I could think about. I texted her, "Did you take the locket from my mom's box?" It took her 20 minutes to reply. "What are you talking about?" I waited. Then came the second message. "I borrowed it. I just wanted to feel close to you. I was going to give it back." Borrowed. Not asked, not offered, not even mentioned. Just taken. And not just anything, but a piece of my mother, a piece of history, something sacred. I called her. She answered like she was the one holding the moral high ground. "Michael, it's not a big deal. You weren't even wearing it." I couldn't speak at first. I didn't trust myself. "It's not about wearing it," I said. "It's about what it meant, about what she meant. You don't take that. You don't touch that without asking." She started crying. Said she missed me, that she wanted to hold on to something real. But you can't steal meaning and call it love. She told me she left it at her parents' house, said it was too valuable to keep in her purse. I drove over that same afternoon. I didn't text, I didn't call, I just showed up. Linda opened the door. Her face tightened the second she saw me. "Is this about the locket?" she asked. "Jessica told me it was a misunderstanding." "No," I said. "It was a choice." Jessica came down the stairs with the locket in her hand, dangling between her fingers like it was just another necklace. I took it, checked the clasp, put it in my pocket. She whispered, "I'm sorry," but I was already walking out the door. That's when it finally settled in. Some people don't draw the line at disrespect. They keep going until they've taken the last part of you that wasn't theirs to touch. And sometimes what they take isn't even the worst part. It's what they don't understand about why it mattered. That locket wasn't just jewelry. It was a bond, a promise, a thread between generations. And for her, it was just something to hold on to when she felt guilty. That was the last time I saw her. And in some strange way, it brought me peace. Because the moment you reclaim what someone tried to take from you, not just a thing, but a part of your story, is the moment you know you're done explaining yourself. But I still had one more thing to do. Not for her, for my mom, and for me. Closure isn't something you find neatly folded at the end of a story. It's not a clean break or a perfect goodbye. It doesn't arrive with a bow on top or a soundtrack that tells you now you can move on. Closure is messier than that, slower, quieter.
Sometimes it looks like standing in your own apartment, holding a locket in your palm, realizing the version of life you imagined no longer fits. After I walked out of Jessica's parents' house, I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel strong. I felt tired, like I'd been carrying someone else's shame, someone else's silence, someone else's version of love for far too long. But that exhaustion had weight to it, and weight can be grounding. I went home. I placed the locket back into my mom's box, not out of sadness, out of gratitude. It belonged to someone who understood what love looked like in action, not just in words. The texts stopped after that. The calls did too. And in that stillness, something shifted. I remembered the kind of life I wanted to build, the kind of family I wanted to grow into. Not perfect, not polished, but rooted in something real. Kindness, honesty, mutual protection. My mom used to say, "You don't need to explain your boundaries to people who respect you. They'll feel it in how you walk." I think that's what closure really is. It's not convincing someone to see your worth. It's remembering it for yourself. It's being able to look back, not without pain, but without bitterness. And slowly, the noise fades. Not because it stops, but because you stop listening. You start living in the present again. And you realize the strongest kind of love is the one that lets you walk away when staying would mean shrinking. I don't regret calling off the wedding. I regret not doing it sooner. And if I could speak to the version of myself who sat quietly at that dinner table, hoping things would get better, I'd tell him this: you don't have to set yourself on fire to keep the room warm. Leave, heal, breathe. Because you deserve a life where no one laughs at your grief and calls it love. And if that life hasn't found you yet, don't worry. You're getting closer every time you stop apologizing for needing more.
Looking back now, it wasn't just one moment that changed everything. It was a slow build, a pattern, a collection of red flags I called quirks. 1,000 quiet compromises I told myself were part of love. It was Jessica laughing when she should have stood still. It was Rick and Linda dressing up cruelty in polished speeches. It was a family who took my mother's generosity and turned it into a punchline. And it was me, learning, too late, that silence isn't always grace. Sometimes it's just self-abandonment. But this story isn't about regret. It's about clarity, about finding the strength to say, "This is enough." To walk away not just from a wedding, but from a future that was never going to protect the best parts of me. I didn't just dodge a bullet that night. I burned the whole weapon they used to make me feel small. Their approval, their guilt trips, their stories about who I was and who I should have been. And I chose to write something else. A story where kindness isn't weakness, where love doesn't mean silence, where grief isn't something to be joked about just to keep a dinner table comfortable. I don't share this because I think I'm special. I share it because I know I'm not. Because somewhere out there, someone's watching this, sitting at their own version of a long, uncomfortable table, wondering if they're imagining it, if they're being too sensitive, if speaking up will make things worse. You're not imagining it. And no, you're not too sensitive. You're awake. You're the one in the room who knows what love should feel like. And that means you're closer than you think to something better, something real. We all carry stories like this, the ones that hurt more than they should, the ones we hesitate to tell because we're afraid no one will believe us, or worse, that they'll say, "It wasn't that bad." But if you've made it this far, I want to ask something of you. Tell your story. In your own words, in your own time. There's a link pinned in the comments where you can share it, anonymously if you want. We'll read every single one. And every time your story helps someone else feel seen, it becomes more than a memory. It becomes a light. And more than that, for every 1,000 views this video gets, we'll donate $1 to a fund that supports people rebuilding after loss, betrayal, and emotional abuse. Because healing deserves more than silence. It deserves action. This won't be the last story we tell. There are more voices out there waiting to be heard. And if you've got one of them, we're listening. So, if you've ever walked away from something that no longer saw your worth, I'm proud of you. If you haven't yet, but you're thinking about it, you're not alone. We're just getting started.